Just by any chance, does anyone know a lot about the invention of children's clothing during the Enlightenment? Okay, great. So you all learned something.
So you have no idea if you're telling the truth.
Yeah. I'm bad at lying, so you'll be able to tell. The look of childhood in every era is a really interesting way to come to terms with ideas about children's role in society, how children are regarded. And this is especially interesting if you compare the look of children to adults in every period. Like today it's interesting, it was interesting 100 years ago, because it's always changing and growing. But there's no period in human history, I think, where the comparison between children and adults was more interesting than in the 18th century, specifically in Georgian Britain. England during this time was, in some ways, a testing grounds for a lot of Enlightenment ideas that were being put into practice. It was a radical period of time where, for the first time in history, people were toying with ideas from Enlightenment thinkers about children being autonomous beings, and they started to have this crazy idea that children were important, that they were not just miniature adults, that they were innocent and they were fragile. And all these ideas we have about kids now were new cockamamie theories before they were put into practice in 18th century England. A lot of these ideas were first introduced by John Locke, who wrote about them in 1693. But they were so radical, but they didn't actually have an impact on society until the 1770s and 1780s. There were a lot of things that came out of the adoption of these new theories and practices. The idea of childhood was invented, and it wasn't just created, it was an explosion. It exploded. For the first time, children were heroes in literature. For the first time, children were the subjects of painting. For the first time, there were toy stores and educational toys and people making globes and puzzles with kids and their development in mind. Pediatrics became a respected field of medicine. And for the first time, children were not necessarily being named after their parents or named after deceased siblings. And they were given middle names. Like they were made more and more individualized and more separate from their predecessors and given a lot more autonomy. But all of this leads to my discussion, which is how children and childhood came to be expressed through the invention of children's clothing, which, believe it or not, only happened as recently as about 1770. Before childhood and in children's clothing were invented, there had to be some radical reforms that had to take place. And the first one was the end of the practice of swaddling. Swaddling was practiced for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years through Europe. And it was the practice of wrapping a newborn infant and really, really, really tightly in long, thin strips of cotton. They thought that if a child was allowed to kick its arms and legs about and move freely, that it would hurt itself and the people around it. And that also, if we physically restrained children, that they would be strong and hardy, and they might survive past infancy. And this is probably one of the most famous images of swaddling. This is a portrait of the Chumley ladies. It's actually how it's pronounced, Chumley ladies. And they were two sisters who got married on the same day and then gave birth on the same day. And both of the babies are wrapped up really, really, really tight in swaddling clothes and then covered in red christening gowns. And here, this is actually an extant swaddling band. That's what it would look like underneath them. And you can tell it's just mummy wrap. They go like this. And the baby would probably be wrapped like that repeatedly. Those would be the clothes it would wear until it was about 2 or 3. Yeah. You know, now when we're all kids and we're playing and growing, when you're 2 or 3, bumping into things, it wasn't an option. So when the Reformation of children's clothing began, this was the first place it happened. People realized that this was kind of a cruel and unjust practice, so it wasn't helpful. And there was another problem with swaddling. Another problem with swaddling is that as soon as kids were taken out of their mummy bands when they were 2 or 3, they were then put immediately into adult clothing. There was no transition. You were a mummified baby who couldn't kick or move, and then you were a miniature general. And this is one of my favorite paintings of a child in a miniature adult costume. This is in the Frick. You can come and see it if you want. It's a painting of Francis Vernon. And he's wearing probably a miniature version of his dad's outfit, guessing his father was a military man. There are other wonderful examples of children being put in adult clothing. This is my favorite, one of my favorite paintings ever. It's William Hogarth's portrait of the children of Dr. Daniel Graham. He was the private physician to the king. And in here, this painting, you can see, this is baby Thomas. He's about 2 or 3. And boys and girls at this time were often both put in corseted gowns, kind of like what their mothers would wear. So that's baby Thomas. And then we have the other extreme on the right is his brother Richard wearing a miniature version of his father's outfits. That would be an outfit worn by a doctor in this period. So you have the 2 extremes there. And then in the middle are their sisters, Henrietta and Anna, who are wearing probably miniature versions of their mother's clothes. This is another nice example. This is a portrait of the daughters of Thomas Gainsborough. And they're running outside and they're chasing a butterfly, but they're also wearing corsets and aprons, so they're probably not they're a bit ineffectual in their butterfly chase, I'm guessing. These restrictive clothings, they didn't allow for kids to play and for kids to learn, and nobody had a bigger problem with this than the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There was such restrictive approach to clothing children was threatened, thank goodness, by the growing popularity of John Locke's Thoughts Concerning Education and Rousseau's book Emile, which was a guide for raising enlightened children. When Emile was first published in 1762, it was something like a children's charter. It was really radical at the time, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that kids didn't need to wear such restrictive clothes, that they needed to play, that they needed to wear natural garments, that they could run and play, that they could climb in trees. He believed that nature was a really important teacher, and that if kids couldn't play outside, they weren't going to grow up to be strong and independent and intelligent people. He urged parents to dress children like children and not like grown-ups. He wrote, "Love childhood, indulge its sports, its pleasures, its delightful instincts. Children must jump, run, shout when they wish. All their movements are from the needs of their constitution, which needs to strengthen itself." And these ideas sparked a revolution. It was one without violent battles, but it was a revolution in the biggest sense. About 1770, 4 years after Rousseau spent some time in England, he was in exile from France, the revolution in children's dress began. The change was very gradual. There were some early adopters, and there were not, same like we have with anything today, which meant that during the last 30 years of the 18th century, you had Rousseau's idealized children running around in natural, loose, flowing clothes, mixing with miniature military generals playing in the streets, if they play in the streets. Kids were slow to adapt to these new ideas. Swaddling was stopped, and more children began to adopt this new, enlightened, free garment called a frock dress, which was loose, usually made of cotton or silk, and allowed kids to play and run and get into trouble and climb in trees. This is Thomas Gainsborough's portrait of the Byam family, and you can see on the right, Selina Byam is wearing this new frock dress. And for the first time ever, kids didn't look like their parents. You can look at this painting, and I don't think you'll see that there's anything that would make you compare her dress to her mother's. And for another comparison, here you can see Selina Byam next to the granddaughters, Henrietta and Anna, and there's just 20 years separating these girls. So you can see that the changes are significant and they're visually obvious. This is a really nice portrait of Henrietta Laura Pulteney. And she's an older girl, but she's still wearing this new frock dress. And she's Rousseau's little girl idealized. She's out in the world. She's free to dance and move around. She's picking flowers. She's got a basket. She's ready to go. It's also documented that Henrietta loved dancing. And that was a hobby that was probably made a lot easier by her new enlightened gown. These new frock dresses also came to change the way little boys and girls were dressed, 2, 3 years old. If you think of Thomas, the baby in the corset that we saw earlier, and compare him to Joshua Reynolds' portrait of Master Hare, you can see there's a huge difference in what babies and toddlers were able to do, and they were able to move and explore nature. Just to place even more emphasis on this enlightened child, he's painted outdoors instead of in a sitting room. And this image has become kind of a trademark go-to idea when people talk about enlightened childhood. This is one of the landmark images which typifies that. There were some other changes that came about, specifically in terms of clothes for little boys, because they weren't going to wear the frock dress. Although they wore the frock dress until they were 2 or 3, there was a problem, because they were still expected to wear grown-up suits when they were about age 7. The practice of putting a little boy in a grown-up suit was still stayed, and around age 7, it was expected that you would be put into a suit that would fit your station in life. So if your father was a general, at 7 you were still going to be put in a general's uniform. Or if your father was a doctor or lawyer, you were going to dress as a doctor or lawyer. But the kids did gain a few years in between, about age 3 to 7, where they got to wear this new invention, the skeleton suit, which was the first suit was designed just for little boys and just for playing. And here we see the children of Richard Arkwright playing on a goat, having a good time, and they're wearing the new skeleton suit. And these suits are called that because they were cut really close to the body, but somehow allowed for a lot of play and movement. The suit included trousers buttoned up to a fancy jacket with a big ruffly collar and a big loose shirt. And we see these images all the time now. When you look at this period, you think of these boys in these suits playing on, well, you don't always think of them playing on goats, but it does happen. And, but this was a radical invention. It was the first suit designed just for little boys. And their sister, she looks nice in her dress too. And then here we have, finally, this is Rousseau's child ideal realized. This is the apex of an enlightened child wearing children's clothes. This is Francis Coates' portrait of Lewis Cage, who's a young cricketer. And we see he's wearing his skeleton suit proudly, but he's just finished a game of cricket. His sock has slid down one below his knee, his shirt's undone, he looks a bit flushed. He's clearly just been playing. And there's a visual joke here too. He's been posed in the same manner of a military general who's just had a victory. We're guessing that he's won his cricket match. But you can see, finally, children are being regarded as totally autonomous and independent and significant people. He dominates the entire picture, and his athleticism and sportsmanship and manliness is worthy of our consideration. And I think it's partly to thank the Enlightenment, it's partly because he was able to play cricket in his new fancy suit and not a corset and not his father's military uniform. And that's it. That's the invention of children's clothing.